August 1942, the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. A German army group commander receives a direct order from Adolf Hitler himself. The order is clear, explicit, and absolutely horrifying. All captured Soviet commissars, political officers, and partisans are to be executed immediately without trial. No documentation, no records, just mass execution. It's part of Hitler's war of annihilation in the East, his vision of destroying not just the Soviet military, but Soviet society itself. Thousands of German officers across the Eastern Front are carrying out this order, participating in what will later be recognized as war crimes and crimes against humanity. But one general, sitting in his headquarters reading this order, does something that should get him court-martialed and executed. He picks up his pen, writes a single sentence across the bottom of the order, and sends it back to his staff. I will not follow that order. This is Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of the most brilliant military strategists of World War II, and the story of how he repeatedly defied Hitler's most criminal orders while somehow remaining in command, trusted and protected even as other officers were being executed for far less. This is the story of how military genius gave one man the leverage to say no to Hitler and survive. Actually, let's pause right there, because I need to tell you something important before we go further. The story I just started, about Erich von Manstein being a noble officer who refused criminal orders, that's partially true, but it's also partially a myth that von Manstein created about himself after the war to avoid being hanged as a war criminal. The real story is more complicated and less heroic. Von Manstein did push back against some of Hitler's orders, yes, but he also carried out others. He was complicit in atrocities, even as he claimed to oppose them. So let's tell a different story, about a different German who actually did say, "I will not follow that order," and meant it completely. Let's talk about Major Karl Plage, the Wehrmacht engineer who saved over 250 Jews in Vilnius, Lithuania, by refusing to follow orders that would have sent them to their deaths. This is the story of how one middle-aged engineer, armed with nothing but bureaucratic cleverness and moral courage, outsmarted both Hitler's extermination machinery and survived to see the liberation. Karl Plage was born in 1897 in Darmstadt, Germany, into a middle-class professional family. His father was a lawyer, and young Karl was expected to follow a similar professional path. He served briefly in World War I as a teenager, was wounded, and returned to civilian life with a deep skepticism about military glory and nationalism. He studied engineering and became a successful automotive engineer, eventually earning a doctorate in engineering in 1924. Through the 1920s and early 1930s, Plage built a career as a technical expert, a practical man who solved problems and built things. He had no interest in politics, no attraction to military life, and no patience for the Nazi ideology that was gaining strength in Germany. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Plage watched with growing alarm as the Nazi Party transformed Germany into a totalitarian state. He saw the persecution of Jews begin. He saw the elimination of political opposition. He saw the militarization of German society. And unlike many Germans who told themselves that things weren't really that bad, or that Hitler would moderate once in power, Plage recognized the Nazi regime for what it was: dangerous, criminal, and leading Germany toward catastrophe. But what could one engineer do against an entire totalitarian state? Plage made a decision that would define the rest of his life. If he couldn't stop the Nazi regime, he would at least try to save some of its victims. When World War II began in 1939, Plage, despite being in his early 40s and not enthusiastic about military service, was drafted into the Wehrmacht. His engineering expertise made him valuable, and he was commissioned as an officer and assigned to engineering units. By 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Plage was a major commanding a repair and maintenance unit, the HKP 562 Vehicle Repair Workshop, in Vilnius, Lithuania. This assignment would give him the opportunity to save lives, but it would require him to become something he never imagined being: a master of deception, bureaucratic manipulation, and quiet resistance. Vilnius in 1941 had a large Jewish population, around 60,000 people, who had lived in the city for centuries. Vilnius was known as the Jerusalem of Lithuania because of its rich Jewish culture and scholarship. But when the Germans occupied the city, the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, immediately began massacring Jews. Within months, tens of thousands had been murdered. The survivors were forced into a ghetto where they lived in terrible conditions, always under threat of deportation to death camps. The Nazi plan was clear. Eventually, all the Jews in Vilnius would be killed. It was just a question of timing and logistics. Major Karl Plager's vehicle repair workshop needed skilled workers. The military vehicles being used on the Eastern Front required constant maintenance and repair. Plager had a legitimate need for mechanics, electricians, metalworkers, and other skilled laborers. And conveniently, many of the Jews trapped in the Vilnius ghetto had exactly these skills. So Plager made a request to the Nazi authorities. He needed Jewish workers for his workshop. This was not unusual. Many German military and industrial facilities in occupied territories used Jewish slave labor. The Jews would work until they were no longer useful, then they would be killed. The Nazis called it extermination through labor. Plager's request was approved, but Plager had a very different plan. He wasn't requesting Jewish workers so he could work them to death. He was requesting them so he could protect them from death, because as long as Jews were classified as essential workers for the German military, they couldn't be deported to death camps. They had to be kept alive. Plager had found a loophole in the Nazi extermination machinery, and he was going to exploit it to save as many lives as possible. Plager began bringing Jewish workers to his HKP 562 workshop. He started with skilled workers who genuinely had the abilities his workshop needed, but then he started expanding the definition of skilled worker in creative ways. He hired children as apprentices. He hired elderly people as supervisors. He hired women as support staff. He hired people with no mechanical skills whatsoever, and then had his German soldiers train them. He kept expanding the workforce far beyond what was actually necessary for the workshop's operations. And every person he brought into the HKP workforce was one more person protected from the death camps. But Plager couldn't just hire Jews and do nothing with them. The Nazi authorities inspected the workshop regularly to ensure that the Jewish workers were actually producing value for the German military. So Plager had to run an efficient workshop that actually repaired vehicles while simultaneously protecting as many Jews as possible. This required extraordinary organizational skill and constant deception. He had to make it appear that every worker was essential, while hiding the fact that many were being protected for humanitarian reasons rather than military necessity. Plager did several things that were revolutionary in this context. First, he treated the Jewish workers with basic human dignity. He ensured they had adequate food, at least by ghetto standards. He provided medical care. He didn't allow his German soldiers to abuse the workers. He established rules that the Jewish workers were to be treated as valuable skilled laborers, not as subhuman slaves. This was so unusual in Nazi-occupied territory that it attracted attention, but Plager justified it with cold pragmatism. You get better work from well-treated workers. The Nazi authorities, always focused on efficiency and productivity, couldn't argue with results, and Plager's workshop was indeed highly productive. Second, Plager actively shielded his workers from Nazi roundups and deportations. When the SS or Gestapo came looking for Jews to deport, Plager produced paperwork showing that all his workers were essential for military vehicle maintenance. He argued, sometimes quite forcefully, that removing his workers would damage Germany's military capabilities on the Eastern Front. He used his status as a Wehrmacht officer and his reputation as an effective manager to push back against the extermination machinery. And incredibly, often it worked. His workers were left alone, while Jews in other parts of the ghetto were being rounded up and killed. Third, and most daringly, Plager created a labor camp adjacent to his workshop where the Jewish workers and their families could live. This HKP camp housed around 250 people at its peak, including many children and elderly family members who had no military value whatsoever. Plager argued that keeping families together improved worker morale and productivity, which again, the Nazi authorities couldn't effectively dispute. In reality, Plager was creating a shelter, a small zone of safety in the middle of a genocide. But here's where the story gets truly remarkable. Plage's actions didn't stop at passive protection. He actively refused orders that would have resulted in his workers' deaths. In 1943, as the Nazi regime accelerated its final solution, orders came down to liquidate smaller ghettos and labor camps throughout occupied territories. All Jews were to be sent to concentration camps regardless of their work status. The HKP camp was on the list to be liquidated. Plage received direct orders to prepare his workers for deportation, and he refused. Not openly, that would have been suicide. But through bureaucratic resistance, delays and creative interpretation of orders. He claimed that removing his workers would create critical vehicle maintenance delays that would affect military operations. He produced statistics and reports showing the irreplaceable nature of his workforce. He made the liquidation of his camp seem like such a bureaucratic and logistical nightmare that the Nazi authorities kept postponing it. He was essentially saying, "I will not follow that order," through every delay, every report, every argument about military necessity. Plage also did something even more extraordinary. He began warning his workers about what was coming. This was incredibly dangerous. If the Nazi authorities discovered that a German officer was telling Jews about impending deportations and killings, Plage would be arrested and likely executed for treason. But Plage felt a moral obligation to give his workers a chance to survive. In carefully coded language during work meetings, he would mention that times were becoming difficult and that workers should make preparations for possible changes. Some of the workers understood what he was really saying. He was telling them to prepare hiding places, to gather supplies, to be ready to flee when the final liquidation came. The final test of Plage's courage came in July 1944. By this point, the Soviet army was advancing westward, pushing the Germans back. The Nazi authorities knew they were running out of time to complete their extermination plans in the Baltic region. Orders came down that all remaining Jews in Vilnius, including those in labor camps like HKP, were to be immediately deported to concentration camps in Estonia and later to death camps. There was no more delaying, no more bureaucratic maneuvering. The final liquidation was happening. Plage, knowing he couldn't stop it this time, did something incredibly brave. On the day before the liquidation was scheduled to begin, he gathered all his Jewish workers for what he claimed was a routine work meeting. But instead of discussing vehicle repairs, he gave a speech that was clearly designed to warn them without explicitly saying what was about to happen. He talked about how the military situation was changing. He mentioned that the workshop might need to relocate. He said that workers should be prepared for all possibilities. And then he said something that sent a clear message to those who were listening carefully. He wished them all good luck and safety in the difficult times ahead. The workers understood. Plage was telling them that the deportation was imminent, that they needed to hide, that this might be their last chance to survive. That night, dozens of workers and their families went into hiding. They hid in the workshop buildings, in bunkers they had secretly prepared, in the surrounding areas. When the SS came the next day to liquidate the camp, they found fewer people than expected. Some had escaped because of Plage's warning. During the liquidation itself, Plage tried one more time to protect his workers. He argued with the SS officers, insisting that his workers were essential for military operations. He delayed the deportations for several hours, giving more people time to hide. He was told in no uncertain terms that if he continued to interfere, he would be arrested. Plage backed down, but he had bought precious time. Of the approximately 250 Jews who had been under his protection at the HKP camp, around 250 had a fighting chance at survival because of his warnings and delays. In the chaos of the liquidation and the advancing Soviet army, many of those who went into hiding survived. When Soviet forces liberated Vilnius in July 1944, survivors emerged from their hiding places. They had survived the Holocaust not through luck alone, but because Karl Plage had protected them for 3 years and had warned them at the crucial moment. Approximately 250 Jews survived because of Plage's actions, including entire families with children who would have been immediately murdered otherwise. After the war, Plage's story took an interesting turn. He was initially suspected by the Allies of being a war criminal simply because he had been a German officer on the Eastern Front. He was investigated and briefly detained. But Jewish survivors of the HKP camp came forward and testified on his behalf. They told investigators about how Plagg had protected them, treated them humanely, and warned them before the final liquidation. The investigation was dropped, and Plagg returned to civilian life in Germany, where he resumed his career as an engineer. But Plagg never spoke publicly about what he had done. He didn't seek recognition or honors. He didn't write memoirs or give interviews. He simply lived quietly in Darmstadt, working as an engineer until his death in 1957 at the age of 60. He never explained why he had done what he did, never claimed to be a hero, never sought validation for his choices. To him, apparently, refusing to follow orders that would have killed innocent people was simply the right thing to do, not something that required explanation or praise. It wasn't until decades after Plagg's death that his story became widely known. Survivors and their descendants began researching and documenting what he had done. In 2005, nearly 50 years after his death, Karl Plagg was recognized by Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, as righteous among the nations, an honor given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. His children accepted the honor on his behalf, learning details about their father's wartime actions that he had never shared with them. So why didn't Hitler punish Karl Plagg? Why didn't the Nazi regime arrest and execute him for his clear defiance of orders and his protection of Jews? The answer reveals something important about how resistance operated under totalitarian regimes and how the Nazi system actually functioned in practice. First, Plagg was smart enough to never openly defy orders. He didn't say, "I refuse to follow that order," in a way that could be documented and reported. Instead, he worked within the system, using legitimate military and bureaucratic justifications for his actions. He framed everything he did as serving Germany's military interests. His workshop was productive. His vehicles were well maintained. His reports showed excellent efficiency. On paper, he looked like a model officer who was maximizing the utility of available labor resources. The humanitarian motivation behind his actions was hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic competence. Second, Plagg operated in the regular Wehrmacht, not in the SS or Gestapo. The Wehrmacht, while certainly complicit in Nazi crimes, had some remaining traditions of military professionalism and officer independence. As long as Plagg was getting results and his workshop was functioning well, his superiors were inclined to leave him alone. The SS might have been more suspicious of his methods, but they didn't directly control Wehrmacht logistics operations. Plagg exploited this bureaucratic separation to create space for his humanitarian activities. Third, Plagg was geographically fortunate. He was in Vilnius, not Berlin. He was managing a vehicle repair workshop, not a concentration camp. He was dealing with local Nazi authorities who were more concerned with their own performance metrics than with ideological purity. By the time higher authorities might have taken notice of his unusual treatment of Jewish workers, the military situation was deteriorating, the Soviet army was advancing, and the Nazi bureaucracy was becoming increasingly chaotic. Plagg slipped through the cracks of a system that was beginning to fall apart. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Plagg never attracted attention by being too successful at saving Jews. He protected 250 people, a significant number, but not so many that it triggered alarms at higher levels of the Nazi hierarchy. He saved lives quietly, one family at a time, through gradual expansion of his workforce rather than dramatic gestures. He understood that visible large-scale rescue operations would be shut down immediately, so he worked on a scale that was significant enough to matter, but small enough to avoid detection. But we also need to acknowledge the limits of what Plagg could do and the moral complexity of his position. He was a German officer serving the Wehrmacht, which was engaged in a war of aggression and genocide. His vehicle repair workshop kept German military vehicles running, which enabled the Nazi war machine to continue operating. The vehicles he repaired were used in military operations that killed millions. Could Plagg have done more? Could he have sabotaged his own workshop, destroying vehicles instead of repairing them? Could he have actively fought against the Nazi regime instead of working within it? These are hard questions without easy answers. Plagg apparently concluded that he could do more good by staying in his position and using it to protect people than by engaging in active sabotage that would have gotten him arrested and eliminated his ability to help anyone. He chose to work within the system to save lives rather than destroy the system at the cost of those lives. Was this the right choice? The 250 people who survived because of him would probably say yes. But we can also understand the argument that compromising with evil even to save lives involves moral costs that are difficult to calculate. What makes Plague's story particularly powerful is that he was so ordinary. He wasn't a general with significant power. He wasn't a politician with political connections. He wasn't wealthy or influential. He was a middle-aged engineer commanding a small vehicle repair workshop in an occupied city. He had limited resources, limited authority, and was constantly at risk of being discovered by the very system he was subverting. Yet he managed to save 250 lives through nothing more than cleverness, bureaucratic skill, and moral courage. Plague's story also reveals something about the phrase, "I will not follow that order," and how it operated in practice under Nazi Germany. You couldn't say it directly, you couldn't refuse openly, but you could delay. You could interpret orders creatively. You could use bureaucracy as a weapon against the very system that created it. You could say yes while meaning no, comply on paper while resisting in practice, serve the machine while secretly sabotaging it. This kind of resistance wasn't heroic in a traditional sense. It didn't involve dramatic confrontations or public stands, but it saved lives. And in the context of the Holocaust, saving even one life was a triumph. The Jewish workers who survived because of Plague never forgot him. After the war, they and their descendants worked to ensure his story was remembered. They testified about his character, his warnings, his protection. They made sure that when he died in 1957, his obituary noted that he had saved Jewish lives during the war, even though Plague himself had never sought such recognition. They ensured that his children and grandchildren knew what their father and grandfather had done. And they made sure that Yad Vashem recognized him as righteous among the nations, cementing his place in history as someone who chose humanity over obedience. There's a detail from Plague's warning speech to his workers on the day before the liquidation that survivors remembered decades later. Plague ended his remarks by saying, "I don't know what will happen, but I hope you all have luck." In German, the word he used for luck was Glück, but the way he emphasized it, the way he looked at his workers when he said it, made it clear he meant something more. He was saying goodbye. He was saying he had done everything he could. He was saying they were on their own now, but they had a chance because he had warned them. It was the closest he could come to saying, "I will not follow that order to send you to your deaths," without explicitly committing treason. Today, the descendants of the Jews' Plague saved number in the hundreds. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, entire family trees that exist because one engineer refused to follow orders that would have killed their ancestors. These descendants gather occasionally to remember Plague and to ensure his story continues to be told. They represent something profound, the continuing impact of one person's moral choices. Every time someone chooses courage over complicity, humanity over obedience, the effects ripple forward through time in ways that are impossible to fully measure. Karl Plage's story is a reminder that heroism under totalitarian regimes often looks nothing like we expect. It's not dramatic speeches or grand gestures. It's quiet defiance. It's bureaucratic cleverness used for humanitarian purposes. It's finding loopholes in systems of death and exploitation. It's treating people with dignity when the state demands you treat them as less than human. It's warning people when you're supposed to keep them ignorant. It's saying, "I will not follow that order in 1,000 small ways that add up to saving lives." The German who said, "I will not follow that order," and survived, wasn't a general or a famous figure. He was Karl Plague, an engineer who used paperwork and bureaucracy and creative interpretation of regulations to protect 250 Jews in Vilnius from the Holocaust. He wasn't punished because he was clever enough to frame his defiance as efficiency, because he operated in the chaos of occupied territory where oversight was imperfect, and because he never drew enough attention to become a target. He survived not through luck alone, but through intelligence, careful planning, and an understanding of how to work within an evil system while subverting it. And perhaps most importantly, he survived long enough to see liberation. to know that the people he protected had made it, to understand that his refusal to follow orders had mattered. He lived for 13 more years after the war, quietly working as an engineer in Germany, never seeking recognition, never writing his memoirs, never positioning himself as a hero. But he knew what he had done, and the survivors knew, and now, decades after his death, we know too. We know that in the heart of one of history's greatest evils, there was an engineer who looked at an order to send innocent people to their deaths and said, in every way that mattered, I will not follow that order. And because of that refusal, 250 people lived. And because those 250 people lived, hundreds more were born who would never have existed. That's the legacy of refusing to follow evil orders. That's why Karl Plager's story matters. That's why we need to remember that even in the darkest times, individual moral choice still matters, and one person's courage can save not just lives, but entire futures.